If you've ever hated going to school, ever been punished for not memorizing your lesson, then congratulations, you've been living the exact life of a Roman child. 2,000 years ago, a kid in the city of Rome also sat in class, also wrote assignments, also got beaten for forgetting homework, exactly like you today. And the three skills Rome forced every child to master: writing, memorizing, and obedience, are still being taught in your school right now. Writing not to be literate, but because in Roman society, whoever spoke best held the power, and words were the most powerful weapon of all. Memorizing, because in a world with no printed books, no internet, the human brain was the only hard drive capable of storing an entire civilization. Obedience, because the Roman Empire didn't need people who could think, they needed gears that ran perfectly inside a colossal machine. But the most fascinating part isn't those three skills, it's the story behind them. The story of how Rome invented school. And that story begins before schools existed, with a Roman father who personally taught his son everything from reading and writing to sword fighting and swimming. Alongside him was a Greek slave who accidentally transformed the way Rome thought about education and altered the course of history itself. To understand how Rome invented school, we must go back to a time when schools didn't exist at all, when the father was the teacher. In early Rome, schools simply did not exist. Education lay entirely in the hands of the family, specifically the father, the supreme head of the household. Pater familias, that's what Romans called the man who led the family, the one who held absolute power of life and death over his wife, children, slaves, and all property. And teaching his children was his most sacred duty, not out of love, but because it was the only way to reproduce a Roman citizen. Cato the Elder was the perfect embodiment of this kind of father, the man history records as the harshest patriarch in all of ancient Rome. He personally taught his son everything: reading, writing, law, javelin throwing, sword fighting, swimming, and even how to endure the most brutal heat and cold. Cato refused to let slaves teach his son despite their high education, because he said he would not have his child owe a debt to a slave for something as priceless as education. That statement reveals something profound. Romans considered education the most sacred thing of all. So sacred it could not be entrusted to any outsider. But then everything changed. In 272 BC, Rome conquered Tarentum and for the first time made deep contact with Greek culture. Livius Andronicus, a slave captured from Tarentum, was brought to Rome and became the first teacher to educate the children of his own master. Then he did something no one expected. He translated the epic poem The Odyssey into Latin and accidentally created the empire's very first textbook. A slave wrote the book that gave birth to the education system of the most powerful empire in the ancient world. That is the first paradox of this story. And the second paradox is even stranger. Wealthy Roman children spoke Greek before Latin because Greek slaves raised them from the moment they were born. As the poet Horace wrote, Greece was captured, but captured its conqueror. In return, the defeated conquered the victor's culture through education. Schools were born. Ludus was primary school, Grammaticus was secondary, and Rhetor was the highest level where the art of oratory was taught to the elite. But Roman schools had no buildings of their own. Teachers taught on street corners, under awnings, in public squares, or in whatever empty warehouse had space. The poet Martial once complained that the teacher's voice shattered the neighborhood's sleep before the rooster crowed with a rough voice and the crack of a whip. A primary teacher's salary was just 50 denarii per student per month, while a bushel of wheat cost 30 a whole month's teaching wasn't worth 2 bushels of grain. The teacher sat in a large chair, students sat on stools arranged in a semicircle, writing on wax tablets balanced on their knees, with a stylus one end pointed for writing, the other flat for erasing. The system was entirely private. Rome never passed a law requiring school attendance. Only wealthy children completed all 3 levels. Girls were almost entirely excluded. But for those who did attend, the system was extraordinarily effective, and the first skill they taught wasn't literacy, but how to turn words into weapons. For the Romans, writing wasn't about knowing how to read. Writing was the only path to power in a society where you argued to survive. Step 1. The child learned the alphabet on a wax tablet, letters, then syllables, then words, then sentences. The teacher read once, and the student repeated 10 times. The writing tools were a wax tablet and a stylus made of iron or bronze. One end pointed for carving letters, the other flat for erasing and rewriting until it was perfect. Step 2. Moving up to the Grammaticus level, studying grammar, poetry, Greek and Latin literature, and beginning the first short speeches of their lives. The final step was the Rhetor, the pinnacle of Roman education, where the art of oratory was taught, and very few students had the money or talent to reach it. Why was oratory so important? Because Rome was a society where every major decision was made with words, not swords. The Senate debated, the courts debated, elections debated. No newspapers, no television, whoever spoke best held the power. In other words, rhetoric wasn't a subject, it was a weapon, and any Roman who mastered it could change the course of their entire destiny. There was one man who proved this more clearly than anyone in Roman history. His name was Cicero, born in 106 BC. Cicero was born in Arpinum, a provincial town far from Rome. His family belonged to the equestrian class, not aristocrats, and no one had ever held high office. The Romans called him a novus homo, a new man, the term for someone without noble roots, and the elite looked down on such people with contempt. Cicero's father sent him to Rome to study with the finest teachers, rhetoric, philosophy, law, then on to Athens and Rhodes to continue his education. Returning to Rome, Cicero used his oratory to climb the political ladder step by step, from lawyer to quaestor to praetor, each rung scaled by the power of speech. In 63 BC, Cicero was elected consul at the age of 42. The minimum age allowed the first novus homo to achieve this in 30 years. A man with no noble blood, no army, no vast fortune, armed with nothing but rhetoric, rose to the highest office in the entire Roman Empire. His greatest moment came when Cicero stood before the Senate, faced the conspirator Quintilian, and used only words, no sword was drawn. He opened his mouth and asked quo usque tandem, "How long will you go on?" And with words alone, he drove the traitor from the city forever. That is the power of writing, Roman style, not to be literate, not to compose poetry, but to forge words into the sharpest weapon imaginable. Cicero is living proof from 2000 years ago, proof that education can transform a nobody into the most powerful person in all of Rome. But for words to have power, you first need knowledge, and in a world without printing presses or the internet, knowledge existed in only one place. There was only one way to store knowledge in the ancient Roman world, and that was to cram it all inside the brain of a living human being. The second skill Rome taught every child was to turn the brain into a hard drive, and their methods will make you rethink the way you learn. Cicero proved words could move mountains. But the next question is, where did the knowledge to speak come from when books didn't yet exist in this world? The answer lies in the second skill, the skill Rome valued as highly as rhetoric, yet today has been almost entirely forgotten memory. Before we talk about memory, remember that everything you've just heard about Cicero began with an ordinary child who got the chance to go to school at the right time. Today you have books, the internet, cloud storage, but Rome had none of that. Their only hard drive was the human brain. The method for training memory was simple but brutal: read aloud, then repeat, then copy by hand, then memorize by heart every day, without rest, without end. The content to be memorized included Homer's poetry, Roman law, and moral maxims. All of it had to be crammed inside the brain of every Roman child. The first textbook was Livius Andronicus's translation of the Odyssey, the slave you heard about earlier, the man who gave birth to the empire's education. Memorizing Homer wasn't just remembering a story. When you memorized Homer, you were absorbing values, courage, honor, loyalty, duty to family. Memory wasn't just a storage technology, it was how Rome transmitted morality from one generation to the next without ever needing to write it down on paper. and there was one man who understood this more deeply than anyone. His name was Quintilian, born around 35 AD in the land of Spain. Quintilian came to Rome and became the leading teacher of rhetoric, so famous that he was the first person ever paid by the state to teach oratory. Under Emperor Vespasian, he received a salary from the national treasury and taught the emperor's own grandchildren. The provincial teacher now stood at the heart of power. Quintilian believed that memory exists even in small children and is especially strong in early childhood. So he proposed that education should begin as early as possible. After retiring, Quintilian wrote the Institutio Oratoria, 12 volumes on how to educate a human being from birth to adulthood. But here is the most moving part. When he sat down to write the book on raising children, Quintilian had already lost his young wife, the woman he loved most in the world, and both his sons. The father, who wrote 12 volumes on how to raise children, no longer had a single child left to teach, no one left to hold. In that book, he wrote that when children are beaten, the pain and fear produce results that cannot be spoken. The humiliation makes children fear the light itself. 2,000 years ago, one man stood up and said that beating children is wrong, that education built on fear will create people who live in fear for the rest of their lives. Quintilian proposed that teachers should take the place of parents, teaching with love instead of fear, letting children learn through play instead of the rod. But Quintilian was the exception. Most of the Roman education system was built on an entirely different foundation, and that foundation was obedience. Writing to seize power, memorizing to preserve knowledge, but the third skill was the one Rome truly wanted to teach, and it has a very dark side. The final skill wasn't part of any official curriculum, but it seeped into every lesson and every crack of the whip: absolute submission. And this is where the story gets complicated, because the system taught creativity through rhetoric but demanded obedience, and that contradiction would destroy everything. Quintilian lost his wife and children, then wrote an education book for millions of others that is the legacy of love. But the system itself was not built on love. It was built on discipline, on the rod, and on an unwritten code of rules that every Roman citizen had to follow from the moment they could walk until the day they died. That code was called mos maiorum, the customs of the ancestors, controlling everything from how you dressed, how you spoke, to how you thought about the world. If you're Vietnamese, think of mos maiorum as the Roman version of honor your teacher, respect the way, ancestral morality, and respect your elders, yield to the young, all rolled into one. A Roman child had to obey absolutely father, teacher, state, with no right to argue, no right to ask why, only to listen and comply. Punishment came from the ferula, a wooden rod or a leather whip. Sometimes a slave held the child's limbs while the teacher struck, and Quintilian called it torture. Augustine, the greatest mind of the ancient world, once wrote, "I hated learning and hated being forced. Even a genius was once a child, terrified of the sound of the rod." And here is the greatest paradox: Rome taught rhetoric, which demanded critical thinking, yet forced students into absolute obedience, creativity, and submission at the same time. Creativity and submission, those two things cannot coexist. The Senate knew this better than anyone, which is why they did something shocking. In 92 BC, the Senate expelled all teachers from Rome. The official reason: they feared students were becoming too intelligent. They feared Greek philosophy encouraged disobedience, feared rhetoric created people who dared to challenge the state, feared education would become a weapon turned against them. Power feared the very tool that had created power. Education created Cicero, but it could also create his overthrow. That is the eternal fear of every empire. And that was also the fatal flaw: the system served only the elite, leaving the majority behind. It emphasized obedience and thus lacked innovation and creativity. When mos maiorum decayed, when people no longer believed in the customs of their ancestors, the empire lost its only binding glue and began to crack from within. Rome's education system built the greatest empire of antiquity, but also sowed the seeds of its collapse. Because it never allowed anyone to think differently. 3 skills: writing to seize power, memorizing to preserve knowledge, obedience to maintain order, a perfect formula for empire, but with no room for the individual. At this point, the biggest question remains unanswered. If Rome fell, then why has its education system survived all the way to this very day, this very year? The answer lies in a book locked away in darkness for over 1,000 years, and one man who risked everything to bring it back to the light. Rome collapsed, but its educational legacy survived, and the story of how it survived is truly the most astonishing part of all. If it weren't for one man who copied by hand for 54 days inside an ancient monastery, schools today might look completely different. And that story begins in 1416, when an Italian humanist named Poggio walked into an ancient monastery in Switzerland. The Roman Empire fell, but its education system did not. The trivium grammar, logic, and rhetoric lived on inside medieval monasteries. In 1416, Poggio Bracciolini, an Italian humanist, arrived at the monastery of St. Gall in Switzerland, searching for ancient manuscripts. And he found it the only complete copy of the Institutio Oratoria, Quintilian's book, locked in a dusty, dark room for over 1,000 years. Poggio described the place as a dungeon, dark, damp, unfit even for a prisoner, yet the book had lain there for more than a millennium. The monks refused to lend it. Poggio sat down and copied it by hand for 54 consecutive days, page by hand, no printing press, no copies. When news reached Italy, the humanist Leonardo Aretino wrote to Poggio, "Please send me the manuscript so I may see it before I die," every word trembling with urgency. A book locked in darkness, a book that taught how to enlighten the mind, one man copying by hand for 54 days, saved the education of an entire continent. The Institutio Oratoria became the foundation of Renaissance education. Rome's trivium evolved into the liberal arts, and Western education as we know it was born. Compare Rome with Vietnam's Confucian tradition, the same formula. Memorize the classics, revere the teacher, discipline with the rod, produce officials to serve the state. Two civilizations on opposite sides of the earth, with no contact whatsoever, arrived at the exact same educational formula as if some eternal template exists. Schools today still test through written exams, still check memorized knowledge, still enforce disciplinary codes. Rome's 3 skills remain fully intact right here. 2,000 years. 3 skills. The genetic code of education has barely changed, and the question is why it has endured so stubbornly. Because education was never just about teaching knowledge. Education is how a society reproduces itself, and Rome understood that earlier than anyone else. Rome understood a simple but profound truth earlier than anyone who ever controls education controls the future. That is the lesson of all time. The next time you sit in class, write an assignment, try to memorize a lesson, or follow school rules, remember, you are doing exactly what a Roman child once did.